is really not a problem. I mean, that means we can really store enormous amounts of data. Then we have a velocity. Data must travel fast today. I mean, we watch Netflix and other streaming channels, and I mean, this is all data that is traveling extremely fast. I mean, otherwise also we wouldn't even be able to host this session here, or this whole event probably is not even possible. So big data makes all this even possible. Then we have variety. So data comes in all different types of formats and flavors, from structured data sets and traditional database tables to more unstructured information, such as emails, video, audio, pictures, etc. So the benefits from big data, they are pretty obvious, right? I mean, cost savings, time reductions, ultimately efficiency. And we produce more and more data every single day. I mean, with big data, it's really getting bigger and bigger. I mean, I have read actually before that over the last 2 years, we have produced approximately 90% of all data that exists today. And projections are that by 2025, as it's seen here on that slide, that there will be 175 zettabytes of data. And that is a number with a lot of zeros, obviously. So what is important to recognize is that big data is something that we and businesses were benefiting from it a lot. I mean, when we talk about project management, we also will be fed with more and more information. So information is really power, as it should help to reduce uncertainty. And therefore, it becomes a very important element for the project management practice. But the more data we are producing, the more we will also face challenges, obviously, to manage that amount of data. And as a matter of fact, I mean, data is growing so exponentially fast that most of the data out there is not even being used and just sits idle without providing any benefit to organizations. And that is where the concept of dark data comes into the picture. So what exactly is meant by dark data? So actually, before we go further into the details, I actually would like to hear from you what you usually associate with when you hear about dark data. And I switch quickly over to a quick poll, actually. So you can actually go to that website here, menti.com, using that code here, 6515946. And that's what comes to your mind when you think about dark data. I mean, I mentioned before, you know, for me at the beginning, when I heard about this before, I was thinking about like something sinister, obscure, Star Wars, something like this. But maybe you have dealt with dark data before in your organization, or actually still new to this term. But what comes to your mind right away when you think about it? So feel free to go to that URL and type in a term. And feel free to actually submit multiple answers.
So Marcus, it's mentimeter.com, right?
Yeah, menti.com, is it?
Menti.com, okay.
Okay, we got some answers, that's good. So hidden agendas, unused data, unknown, pollution, interesting, okay. Raw data, yes. Correlation. Obtained illegally. Oh, that's an interesting thought. Yeah, data obtained illegally. Okay. So, okay, we have some different views, actually. I mean, we get from some hidden data or data that's not used to even illegal data or even unknown, secret. So all interesting thoughts here. Cookies, also an interesting point. So let me actually, thanks for the answers, and let me actually go back right now and let's go through the official more or less the most used definition that comes from Gartner. So this is a definition which is actually widely accepted as an accurate definition of dark data. So data that is dark is collected and stored, but it is then not being used for any particular purpose. So dark data is unused, and yeah, because it is unused, it becomes dark. So one problem certainly is that dark data requires storage. It is stored and therefore it consumes resources, although nowadays storage is very cheap, right, as I mentioned before. But what is a bigger problem actually is that such data potentially could hold valuable information for business operations, and it is not being used. So let's look at some examples of dark data to make that whole topic a little bit more tangible. I mean, most dark data is unstructured data that we actually fail to process properly. I mean, take an email or a message, a tweet, for example, right? I mean, a tweet is dark as it needs to have the language extracted so that a computer can analyze actually what is written in it. So the tweet even may contain images or audio, which requires image recognition tools and to extract information therein. Or take another example, which is more like business related and comes closer to actually our topic here about project management. So take an example of a business meeting where you draw up thoughts, solutions, processes, etc. on a whiteboard or a flip chart. I mean, to ensure that we have this captured somehow, we often actually then go and take pictures of the whiteboard or the flip chart with our mobile phone, upload that image to a SharePoint folder maybe, and this way think actually that we have stored valuable information. And that probably even would help indeed for a specific audience, maybe even the audience in that particular meeting or a particular project or a defined group, right? But it isn't stored or processed in a way that this will provide lasting value and insights to an entire organization. Because such information, apart from that it actually on a picture, it actually goes dark because it is not really being shared across the organization or with future or other project teams. And the same is actually valid for items such as presentation materials, scanned documents, and such items where you actually need to extract the information and also share it basically or make it widely accessible so it can be further used. So why data goes dark? I mean, what triggers data to go dark? I mean, there are essentially 4 drivers for this. So first, processes. I mean, we may have run some system process that generates certain system log files or something of that sort. And we simply have forgotten to clean up such data thereafter. So that data sits there, it's not being used anymore, it goes dark, it is unused. Second, the volume of data. So as we have seen before, I mean, the pace at which data is growing, it goes way beyond our capabilities. So not only the organizational capacity, but even our human capabilities. I mean, there's a human limitation to it, and the amount of data and information is simply way too big for us to fully process all the relevant information. And as a result, some data remains unprocessed and it's not being analyzed, and it simply goes dark. And this also links to the third item regarding resources. I mean, not only that we are missing the manpower to get hold of this huge amount of data to be processed, I mean, organizations often also do not have the necessary tools for that, or they simply do not set this as a priority. And the last driver, but nevertheless a very critical part, is the human behavior. I mean, one thing obviously is that humans, by nature, we make mistakes and we easily can overlook things and deem certain data to be of no value, although it maybe actually represents significant business value. Or we miss to properly store data. We throw it into a wrong hidden location and this way throw data into the dark. And when it comes to project management, I mean, I like to take the example of lessons learned, actually. I mean, I have seen this very often where lessons learned sessions are run, or maybe also agile retrospectives, if you will. We scribble things on post-it notes, maybe. We have some discussion about what went bad and what went okay. We tap ourselves on the shoulders, maybe take a picture again with a mobile phone. And then I'm happy to say that we did a wash-up of our project and all will be better in the future. But where is all this information that has been discussed? It is stored at best maybe as an image from which no information can be extracted. And such information potentially could be of value for any other future project in an organization, not only for that project team that discussed that or run that lessons learned, but also for other project teams, future project teams who actually may run similar projects. So that data goes dark and those lessons learned become kind of dark lessons, if you will. And that's how data ends up dark and makes up a big chunk of data that is not being used at all. I mean, it does not mean that all dark and unstructured data is actually of value. I mean, there is certainly data that is of no value at all and is just stored because, storage is cheap. So let's just store it just in case. But then there's also data that is of actual value, but it goes dark for the reasons that I mentioned before. And the amount of dark data is exponentially increasing with the growth of big data. It means that we have more and more unstructured data that is available, but is not being processed or being analyzed. So based on this, we also can say that there's an increasing risk that we overlook valuable information which otherwise would provide us insights for business operations and decision making. So data is not only giving us a ton of benefits, it also gives us new problems actually and challenges that we need to solve as soon as possible, especially in project management. So when we see those numbers here, we looked already before at the exponential growth of data globally. And this constant increase of information that, as I said, that causes a lot of challenges for organizations as a lot of time is spent to collect, prepare, and analyze data. And there's an estimate of approximately 80% of time that analysts are spending on such activities. So this costs a lot of money and effort while we're not even able to analyze all the relevant data for a particular business problem because of our own limitations. So the result is then that a lot of data is not even being leveraged and it does not go into decision-making processes. As it states here, less than 50% of structured data is being used in decision-making. It means that there remains a high uncertainty, which is actually absurd. Because with so much data out there, we actually should be able to get to more certain and reliable business decisions. So how does dark data impact projects? When thinking about project management, we automatically have to think about certainty and uncertainty. Projects by nature are uncertain, as we have to predict something that is in the future. So there naturally is an uncertainty in projects that needs to be managed by the project manager. And dark data, as it is unleveraged data with potential business value, is therefore a factor towards uncertainty. And since the project manager's job is to make the best attempt to decrease uncertainty, we cannot ignore that factor of dark data. So dark data therefore has clearly an impact on projects and how projects are being managed. And especially because of the need to leverage relevant information for decision-making processes. So projects are mainly driven by decisions, and project managers take decisions constantly on a daily basis. So in a typical decision-making process, we usually look at those four stages here in this process. So we identify and define the problem. We collect all the necessary information that is relevant for the problem and the solution finding at the end. Then we elaborate possible solutions. We assess them. We identify the pros and cons, and then select the best possible solution based on our analysis. And ultimately, we implement the decided solution. And in each of these steps, we require data or information. We need information to really articulate the problem first. We need information to find solution options, and we need data to make the decision itself. And we need it also to monitor the implemented solution. So data is a key driver here. Hence, data is driving decisions and the decision making. So let's look at the role of data and its resulting information in today's projects. And we can differentiate here between the different categories of knowns and unknowns. That means information that we can see or are aware of, and other information that is rather hidden to us. And imagine here really this iceberg. I think it's a really good metaphor. Or even better, I mean, imagine you are sitting on a boat on the ocean, right? On top of that sea here at the iceberg, basically. So, I mean, you see then your boat, maybe you see some other boats around you, or anything that you can actually clearly see that can be categorized here as known knowns. And in project terminology, those are things such as dependencies, issues, resources, or any risks for which we have actually a good grasp regarding its probabilities. And then there are things that are slightly obscure to you. I mean, so when you look into the water from the boat, you may see some fishes or anything that is swimming close to the surface. So you can identify such things, but they are, however, a bit obscure to you because they are in the water, and it becomes fuzzier the deeper it goes. So in project language, again, this could be categorized as project risks for which we do not really have a good view on its probability. I mean, we do not have enough data to fully quantify such risks. And those are rather than the known unknowns. And both the known knowns and the known unknowns represent actually project data that is actually leveraged and used in today's projects. So they go into things like project plans, risk management plans, resource management plans, and so forth. But then we know that there is something even deeper down there in the ocean. I mean, when we look into the water after certain depths, we cannot really identify anything anymore. So however, we know that there is more. There is something more deep down in the ocean. So we know it is there, but we do not really know what it is exactly. And we do not have the ability to look that deep down. And in project management, usually we're not using tools to go that deep to discover such unknown knowns. And then we will have additional risks down there, but we are not capturing such information. It is not being used in projects usually. And the last element are actually the unknown unknowns. So taking that example again of the ocean, I mean, we have the human ability to identify objects to a certain depths of the ocean. And beyond that, we need tools to assist us so that we can identify the unknown knowns. But the unknown unknowns are even deeper, for which we would need even more advanced tools. It requires advanced intelligence to identify such data. And when we talk about dark data, we say that it is unstructured data that is not being processed for use in the business context. In project management, we therefore can say that unleveraged project data, so these two categories here, the unknown unknowns, but also the unknown knowns, are actually dark data, as we do not process such information for project management purposes. The question that each organization then needs to answer ultimately is how dark their project data actually is, because that mainly depends on the maturity of project management processes in an organization. So taking again the example of lessons learned, I mean, we leverage data or information in order to derive lessons from there. I mean, this is being done by a specific project team. And that team is processing that information and hopefully takes learnings from it and hopefully also stores that data appropriately. But if we do not store this information centrally and basically run this in an isolated way, or maybe do not store this information at all, or only as a picture taken from the whiteboard, as I mentioned, then such information goes dark. It is not being processed for an entire organization to make use of it. And the same is valid for historical project information. Such data is of high value for analytics purposes, to make conclusions from past projects for future projects. So instead, project data is only temporarily being used for a project and processed there, but thereafter, the data is going dark usually, as it is not being leveraged as input to subsequent projects. And such data could be useful to find patterns in similar projects or project activities, such as estimates, risks, issues, dependencies, even how project team members performed in the past, and so forth. So such data is usually readily available in systems that are being used today. I mean, think about Microsoft Project or Jira, if you use that, or risk management systems. You have that there. But what often happens is that once a project is completed, such data goes dark. It sits in systems and databases, but it is not further used. And as a result, we have not only generally an increase of dark data, but also an increase of dark project data. And such dark data is exponentially growing, as I said before, just like big data is exponentially growing. And in project management, which is a decision-making business, so to say, where we rely on data and information to make informed decisions on a daily basis, we more and more lose our ability for just that, informed decision-making. So data and information is growing so fast that more and more data is not being used, and it becomes dark at the end. And projects increasingly fail because of bad decisions. So the question obviously is how we can solve this dilemma. And it is clear that technology plays a significant role here, since we have seen before that we as humans are naturally limited and cannot really cope with the current data challenges that we are having. So the goal certainly needs to be to leverage the data that is hidden in projects. I mean, we need to enlighten dark data. We need to process it. We need to identify data that provides value and turn that data into information and ultimately knowledge. And in project management, we are unfortunately a bit behind. I mean, you hear so much about data analytics and artificial intelligence and how it helps businesses to gain insights in so many areas. I mean, I have a career in compliance projects in the financial services sector, and data is key in this area and is treated with a lot of diligence, mainly due to the regulatory demand and the fear of being fined by regulatory bodies. And data analytics and AI, they are increasingly being used in such areas to be more effective and efficient, while of course also making sure that one is being compliant. But such, let's say, more sensitive areas, they also rely on projects. So, for example, to get new regulations implemented in their systems and so forth. And there's an increasing risk that such projects are failing, since we are not making proper use of project data, and we fail to unlock the value of hidden project data. And decision-making in projects is increasingly impacted by this gap. And we need to leverage the capabilities that are actually now available to us with our technology advancements. And data analytics and AI certainly will help us to solve our problem there. So let's look at the typical steps in a decision-making process to understand that better. So each step is impacted by the factors of human bias or our incapabilities to capture sufficient information for an informed decision ultimately. And in fact, already when we identify a problem for which we need to find a solution, we often have limited information available. And we may not be able to grasp the full scope of a problem. And as a consequence, we often then collect and analyze only a subset of data. And mixed with human biases and the missing analytical tools, we are even further handicapped towards a reasonable solution. And when we get to the actual decision making at the end, additional factors for uncertainty kick in, such as gut feeling, political motivations by decision makers, for example, right? And once we implement a bad decision, we might even be hesitant to switch to an alternative solution because we have not enough data or information that gives us enough confidence that an alternative might be better. So why do we have only limited information in the first place? I mean, a lot of data is not being used and is dark to the project. And this way, it does simply not flow into the decision-making process. And as a result, we are truly handicapped and often make bad decisions in projects. So what is needed really is to reduce the risk and uncertainty, and that through better handling of the amount of information. So if you remember the iceberg example before, I mean, the categories of risks are basically, or that we actually capture, are basically the known nouns as well as the known unknowns. So for such categories, there is a confidence that the future will be somewhat like the past, and the probability of a threat or opportunity that can actually be calculated either from experience or actually existing data. So we have a good understanding of the chances for an event to occur then. For the known unknowns, we have less reliable data available for our assessment, but here we could actually leverage statistical data about certain events in the past, and this way can actually make an assessment regarding the probability for a certain event to happen. Then the categories of unknown nouns and unknown unknowns are actually states of uncertainty and are therefore dark to a project and the decision maker ultimately. So unknown nouns means threats or opportunities were identified actually by others, but that information is not available and therefore not visible to the decision maker. So this, as I mentioned before, that's usually happening when information is not being shared in organizations, or we operate maybe in data silos, right? That's what then usually happens. And the unknown unknown is another state of uncertainty where any threats or opportunities have really not been identified and no information whatsoever is available. And that's usually where the black swans, that means those risks with high impact but fully unknown, that's where those risks are actually located. So in summary, the more information we can get about a threat or opportunity, there will be higher confidence when placing such risks on that scale here from impossibility to certainty. So we have means to address risks in these first two categories of known knowns and known unknowns by leveraging available data. But with traditional methods, we are lacking means to address the full scope, basically, including the unknown knowns and unknown unknowns, so the uncertainties. Or in other words, the dark data. And this is where artificial intelligence can actually help by collecting the necessary data and information towards a truly data-informed decision-making and a sound judgment call. So by taking an AI-supported approach for decision-making, where we can take advantage of the strengths that AI clearly has, so to discover and collect all that relevant information at actually every step of the decision-making process, we significantly reduce the risk of bad decisions. At the same time, we will actually reach decisions much sooner because of the speed of the data analysis that's not conducted by humans, but actually by algorithms. And as a result, we will significantly reduce the risk and uncertainty in a project. And we can actually make a sound judgment call at the end with confidence. Okay, this sounds all interesting, you may say, but where should we start, right? I mean, what are the initial steps to consider for the transition to this new approach in project management? So for this, let's get quickly some fundamentals straight in terms of data, information, and knowledge, and the difference between those and how they're interlinked. So data are basically facts and figures, right? It could be structured or unstructured data. It may contain bits of information, maybe even complete information or no information at all. Data alone may not be of value, especially when it comes to unstructured data, videos, image information. I mean, this is, or emails even. I mean, this pure data is not really of value. Such information actually, or such data must be processed first and structured in order to extract value from it and actually process it further, for example, in projects. So we have to turn data into information. And dark data does not make its way to information. It just stays idle and is unused. And information is a form of data that is actually then processed, organized, it is structured, and it provides some meaning. So information adds actually meaning to the data, and it improves the reliability of the data. And it ensures that we actually understand data. And this way also, it contributes to reduce uncertainty. And knowledge ultimately that takes that information and provides the understanding of the subject. So what does that mean? I mean, it means that information is combined with human experience and intuition to draw actually conclusions from information. And such knowledge ultimately gets injected in the decision-making process. So to summarize, processing of data results in information. Such information further manipulated or processed, that becomes knowledge. But the basis to all is data that in project management is usually not properly captured and shared. And therefore, it actually doesn't even make its way to information and knowledge. So what you really want to do is to convert all relevant and valuable project data into knowledge for projects to take, for organizations to take advantage of it, right? And while this applies to actually any data, meaning dark or not dark, let's focus here on the dark data and how dark data is actually transformed into information before we potentially could turn it also into knowledge and actual value for projects. So this here is basically part of or should be a part of an information governance in an organization, which is a process or an activity to process and manage information, all information assets actually in an organization. So that should answer the questions of what types of information we have, where it is, and who owns it, and how long we need to keep it. So we first need to, in the first step, we need to understand how much dark data actually exists. And for this, we need to locate and identify the sources. So, and when we talk about project data, there are numerous types that were mentioned before and are actually known to go dark in many organizations, such as lessons learned, as I mentioned, or employee performance data, or locally stored files, historical project data, I mentioned that before. And then there are other systems or numerous other systems in an organization for which system scans should be conducted by special tools. I mean, for example, any document management or collaboration systems, for example, Office 365, SharePoint, file shares, emails again, right, to scan for any sensitive data that potentially could be useful for a particular project. And once you identify your dark data, we need to classify it. That means we need to understand what type of data that actually is. So we need to understand the content so that we can categorize it. So data could be a vendor invoice. It could be some meeting memo. It could be a contract. anything of that sort. So content analytics with auto classification capabilities, so there are tools like this out there that those can help with such exercise. And classification ultimately helps to differentiate actually between dark data that is of actual value and should be leveraged further, and dark data that is of no value, something that we call actually redundant, obsolete, and trivial. So such data could be safely deleted so that storage is freed up. Then in a third step, we have to remove those data silos that I mentioned before. I mean, it is important that project data is being used across the entire organization. So to gain insights for future projects. So project data that is kept in isolation or just temporarily being used in a project, that is of no help for the advancement of project management in an organization. And here the term data democratization comes to mind, which emphasizes actually on data sharing. So for this purpose, a central data store should be actually established, which links all organizational project data and information in one central place. And then with this, the self-service access to such centrally available data store or repository, that will enable actually all the project teams in an organization to access such data, search for specific information, and run project analytics ultimately on it. And last, and to maintain such setup, I mean, policies need to be created to ensure that data storage guidelines are followed, so that for certain data sets, we're not falling back into these old patterns, such as the famous lessons learned or project information in general. So all this data that actually usually goes dark. So this would ensure that project data is governed appropriately across the entire organization. And it should help to leverage project data that has gone dark. So to each step, there is obviously quite a bit of more detail. So don't get me wrong, however, it would require much more time to elaborate on, but it should give some initial idea. And make no mistake, really, I mean, each organization has a different setup and a different approach to how data is being managed, and proper analysis of a current situation is certainly needed to ensure that the appropriate strategy to leverage dark project data. So it needs to be tailored to any organization individually. But at the end, we would be able to transform dark data into information, which then ultimately can be transformed into actual value for projects by transforming it into knowledge. And to transform it into knowledge and feed that knowledge into decision-making processes, you need data analytics, you need the data analytics capability. And that needs to be built up in your organization, also the project organization. So there's a term which goes into what we call project data analytics. And it usually requires 4 stages to achieve a mature analytics capability, going from initial descriptive analytics to then more prescriptive analytics, which ultimately would enable teams to actually predict the impact of future decisions, and this way determine an optimal solution for problems that we have today. And prescriptive capabilities ultimately use predictions based on historical project data to give insights on possible future challenges or opportunities. So it can provide recommendations and find the optimal path forward, and therefore it can actually help organizations in the decision-making process. So each of these 4 stages are an advancement, certainly, of the analytics capability in an organization, which then also provides more value to an organization. So make no mistake, I mean, it takes time to get to the right maturity and to make use of project data that usually is dark and is currently unused. So, I mean, we have seen that some categories of dark data are relatively easy to bring out of the dark, let's say, by simply being a bit more disciplined with certain data, such as, again, right, the lessons learned. It's my favorite example. But to get real insights from historical project data and also any other relevant data that currently is not being used, and is actually dark. An appropriate information governance approach in an organization needs to be put in place or amended with the elements here for project management. And at the same time, a project data analytics capability needs to be established towards project data analytics discipline. And that should be part of a project management domain within each organization. So it costs effort, but the benefits that organizations would get out of it, they're certainly significant. I mean, we get better insights, and for projects generally, we capture definitely a much wider spectrum of risks and issues, and this way can actually better respond to risks. Project risk and uncertainty will certainly get reduced as we move to a truly data-informed decision-making process. And ultimately, we also improve the effectiveness and efficiency of projects and it will provide significant cost savings. I mean, organizations actually lose a lot of money due to project failures. So it is critical that we can run projects that give stakeholders a certain confidence that there will be some successful outcome. And you may have heard the slogan, I mean, data is the new oil, right? It has become a popular refrain for the digital age, but we simply need to act on it. And maybe I should say, especially we should do that actually for project management. So thank you very much for your attention, and I hope this presentation was somewhat insightful to you and helps you to actually initiate change in the project delivery approach in your own organization, which then also would leverage dark data for project decision making. I mean, here you'll find a little bit of information about myself, including my contact details. So please feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn or send me an email if you're interested to discuss this topic in any way further. Maybe even your specific journey or challenges within your organization. I mean, I would be more than happy to hear from you. And if you have any immediate questions right now, I'm certainly happy to answer those.
Yeah, there are some questions. First thing brought up was an issue by Huria Butman. And that issue is that companies are putting most of the resources in regulatory projects that demand star data, while there are no resources left then to leverage capabilities to light those data. Is this something that you could do? How could you deal with this? Do you have any ideas on that?
Yeah, that is a very good question, and that's what I also. I mean, as I said before, I'm myself working actually in compliance projects, and I see this dilemma myself, right? So I mean, there is a lot of diligence on data in compliance and regulatory-driven projects because, of course, there is a clear driver behind this to meet the demand from regulatory bodies, and it is critical. But as I said before, I mean, one thing is the data that you actually need to meet those regulatory demands. But at the end, any regulatory demand triggers also projects, right? So you need to implement certain regulatory directives or anything in systems, for example, right? And you need to actually run projects on this. So how do you run projects? I mean, with the way we usually do that, right? But we have seen and we know that the success rates of projects, generally speaking, is actually way below what we should expect. And we have an increasing risk actually, or increasing challenges because of what I mentioned with data. We have increasing data, we cannot really get hold of it. And so projects, ultimately, there's a high risk that projects will fail. And when projects fail, we cannot implement regulatory demands. So, of course, it is something that needs to be brought up to more the upper management. It needs something like this. I mean, this whole approach here actually needs to be driven top down in an organization. And I mean, when it comes to the question again, what kind of ideas I have, I mean, what I'm trying to do also in the organization that I'm working for in financial services is actually to raise this topic and raise this concern and actually showcase what actually can be done with data analytics or project data analytics in project management. And we actually run some a proof of concept actually to show the benefits. So that's actually the best you can do, actually, to show what that actually brings and how much benefit that brings to the organization and how much risk you actually mitigate with that. But it is certainly not easy.
That brings me to the next question from Yves Belfan. Are there any tools that you can use to efficiently automate data analytics process? Software, like that.
I mean, there's certainly some tools. I mean, I mentioned that briefly. I mean, some classification tools, for example, to actually leverage data. But then there's additional tools or more advanced tools, especially like AI-driven tools to actually specifically for the project management domain. There are actually several tools that exist already, but they're actually still in its it's beginning, basically, that just basically launch, and a lot of organizations really just wait and see, which is understandable. But there are several organizations out there. I mean, I can provide actually a list of organizations and the tools behind this that are actually being leveraged, and in some cases actually already being implemented in organizations. It's actually not a long list because there are just some a small list of players so far, because especially for that reason, right? That topic of AI and data analytics in project management has been. I mean, we're behind in project management with all this, and there are certain players actually in the UK, for example, who actually work on this on tools to get this implemented, and also to make organizations aware of the problems and the benefits that they would get with such tools and such approach. But it is a fundamental change in project management, and that's actually the most critical piece of it, because it is at the end not only a tool question, it is also a cultural question, because it changes a lot.
Yeah. Okay, then last question here. How would you provision a budget to cover the unknown indication as percentage, for instance, versus total project?
Sorry, say that again. I didn't get to.
So if you are to ask for a budget to do all this, how much should that be compared to the overall project budget?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I mean, because we're still actually and I mean, and see, myself, I'm actually engaged in such approach actually to implement this, and we are still at the very beginning in many ways, right? So it's difficult to say what that actually means in terms of budget, because it's a long journey. Actually, it's not something that can be, you buy a tool, you implement it, and you're done, right? It takes a little bit more than that, because it takes a fundamental change. So, and it depends also a lot on the data maturity in organizations. So it's also different from organization to organization. So the first thing actually needs to be done is really to make an assessment, how it looks like, how mature is the project management practice in an organization, how good is the data governance, right? Do we need to make fundamental amendments, and then what does that mean actually for the processes in an organization? It's quite different, right? So it's not only a tool and implement this, it's actually much broader, which is difficult to say, like generally speaking, in terms of what that would cost or what the budget would be. It's more a question that needs to be tailored to each organization individually.
Okay, thank you. This brings us to the end of this presentation. Leaves us